Imagine waking up tomorrow to find your country's economy completely destroyed. Banks are empty, factories are silent, bridges have collapsed, and millions of people are struggling just to find food. Now imagine another nation arriving with billions of dollars, machines, and a promise to rebuild everything. Sounds like an act of generosity, doesn't it? But what if that generosity also came with a strategy? Welcome to Finite History, where money, power, and history reveal the hidden forces that shaped our world. When World War II ended in 1945, Europe was in ruins. Germany was devastated, Britain was drowning in debt, and millions across the continent faced hunger and unemployment. Yet, just 20 years later, Western Europe had become one of the richest and most prosperous regions on Earth. Most people credit this miracle to the Marshall Plan. But was America simply helping Europe, or was it making one of the smartest investments in history? Did billions of dollars rebuild a continent, or create a new world order centered on American power? In this documentary, we'll uncover how money became more powerful than armies, why Europe's recovery changed the global balance of power, and whether America rebuilt Europe or quietly built its own economic empire.
By the spring of 1945, the guns had finally fallen silent, but Europe's real battle was only beginning. Entire cities had been reduced to mountains of rubble. Berlin, once the industrial heart of Germany, had become a city of broken buildings and shattered roads after relentless Allied bombing. Meanwhile, Warsaw in Poland had suffered even worse. Nearly 85% of the city was destroyed, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without homes. Railways that once carried trade now carried twisted steel. Bridges had collapsed, and factories had stopped producing. Across Europe, millions of families had no homes to return to, while Britain had won the war but was drowning in debt. Peace had arrived, but prosperity was nowhere to be seen. The economic damage was just as devastating as the physical destruction. Inflation weakened national currencies, governments struggled to create jobs, and food rationing became part of everyday life. In many cities, people queued for hours just to receive bread or coal for heating. History has shown that when people lose hope in their economy, they begin looking for radical alternatives. That was exactly what worried leaders in Washington. If Europe remained poor and unstable, another political crisis could erupt at any moment. Across the Atlantic, one nation believed it had both the resources and the opportunity to change Europe's future forever.
As Europe's economy continued to collapse, another crisis was quietly taking shape. Hunger, unemployment, and poverty weren't just creating suffering. They were creating an opportunity for communism to spread. Italy became one of America's biggest concerns. In the 1948 Italian elections, the powerful Italian Communist Party had millions of supporters and was expected to perform strongly. Washington feared that if Italy fell under communist influence, other European nations might follow. A similar situation was unfolding in France, where communist parties had gained enormous popularity among workers who blamed capitalism for the Great Depression and the destruction of World War II. To American leaders, this wasn't simply a political issue. It was a strategic one. If Western Europe embraced communism, the Soviet Union could expand its influence without firing a single bullet. At the same time, the United States possessed the world's strongest economy, untouched industries, and vast financial resources. Instead of asking, "Can we afford to help Europe?" American policymakers began asking, "Can we afford to lose Europe?" Because if Europe collapsed economically, America wouldn't just lose valuable trading partners, it could lose the balance of global power. But before billions of dollars crossed the Atlantic, Washington had one more move to make. It would reshape the world's financial system itself.
Before America invested billions of dollars in Europe's recovery, it first changed the rules of the global economy. In July 1944, while World War II was still raging, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. Their goal was clear: prevent another global financial collapse like the Great Depression. The meeting led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, two institutions designed to stabilize economies and support post-war reconstruction. Most importantly, the US dollar was officially linked to gold at $35 per ounce, making it the world's most trusted currency. A good example of why this mattered was Britain. Although it had won the war, the country was financially exhausted and desperately needed American loans to rebuild its economy. Many other European nations faced the same challenge. They needed US dollars to import food, machinery, fuel, and raw materials. That meant rebuilding Europe would now depend on a financial system centered around the American dollar. Without firing a single shot, the United States had placed itself at the heart of the world's economy. Now that the financial foundation was in place, America was ready to launch the plan that would transform Europe forever, the Marshall Plan.
On June 5, 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall stood at Harvard University and proposed a bold idea that would reshape Europe forever. Instead of punishing war-torn nations, America would help them rebuild. His plan was simple. A stable and prosperous Europe would be less vulnerable to economic collapse and communist influence. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided more than $13 billion in aid, equivalent to well over $150 billion today. This assistance wasn't just cash. It included food, fuel, machinery, industrial equipment, raw materials, and technical expertise that helped restart Europe's struggling economies. A perfect example was West Germany. Marshall Plan funds helped restore factories, modernize steel production, and rebuild transportation networks that had been destroyed during the war. In France, American aid was used to repair railways, expand electricity production, and modernize key industries, allowing businesses to operate efficiently once again. These investments didn't just rebuild buildings, they restored confidence. Businesses started hiring workers, production increased, and international trade slowly returned. At the same time, America also benefited because much of the aid was spent on purchasing American goods and equipment. The Marshall Plan wasn't simply an act of generosity. It was a long-term investment that strengthened both Europe and the United States. But rebuilding economies was only part of America's strategy. To protect this new prosperity, Europe would soon receive something just as valuable as money: security.
At first glance, the Marshall Plan looked like an act of generosity. America sent billions of dollars to help Europe recover from the devastation of World War II. But behind that generosity was a smart economic strategy. Instead of simply handing over cash, much of the aid was used to purchase American products. Europe desperately needed wheat, machinery, tractors, trucks, steel, and industrial equipment, and the United States had all of them. As a result, American factories stayed busy, workers kept their jobs, and the U.S. economy continued to grow even after the war had ended. A perfect example was Ford Motor Company, which expanded its operations in Europe as demand for vehicles increased during the Reconstruction years. American companies such as Caterpillar supplied heavy construction equipment used to rebuild roads, bridges, and factories across Western Europe. At the same time, millions of tons of American wheat were shipped to countries like France, Italy, and West Germany, helping feed populations facing severe food shortages. In other words, Europe received the resources it needed to rebuild, while American businesses gained loyal customers and expanding markets. It was one of history's most successful economic partnerships. Europe recovered, and America strengthened its position as the world's leading economic power. But there was one final ingredient needed to protect this prosperity: security. That would soon arrive in the form of NATO. Rebuilding Europe's economy was only half of America's strategy. The other half was making sure that prosperity would never be destroyed by another war. As tensions with the Soviet Union grew, the United States realized that financial aid alone could not guarantee Europe's future. In 1949, America, Canada, and 10 Western European nations created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The alliance was built on one simple promise: an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. For countries that had experienced 2 devastating world wars within 30 years, this guarantee provided something they had desperately needed for decades: security and stability. One of the best examples of NATO's importance was the Berlin airlift of 1948-1949. When the Soviet Union blocked all land routes into West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out of the city, the United States and Britain responded with one of history's greatest humanitarian operations. For almost a year, Allied aircraft delivered more than 2 million tons of food, coal, medicine, and essential supplies to the people of West Berlin. The mission proved that America was willing to defend Western Europe not only with money, but also with action. With NATO's protection, countries like West Germany, France, and Italy could invest more in factories, schools, roads, and hospitals instead of spending every available dollar on their militaries.
The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's economy while NATO protected it. Together, they created the foundation for decades of peace and prosperity. But as Europe grew richer, an important question began to emerge. Who had benefited the most from this extraordinary partnership? Europe, America, or both?
By the 1950s and 1960s, the results of America's investment were impossible to ignore. Across Western Europe, destroyed economies were turning into industrial powerhouses. One of the greatest success stories was West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Just a few years after lying in ruins, German factories were producing cars, machinery, and electronics that were being exported around the world. At the same time, France experienced a period of rapid economic growth known as Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 Glorious Years, while Italy transformed itself from an agriculture-based economy into one of Europe's leading manufacturing nations. Millions of people found stable jobs, incomes increased, and living standards improved dramatically. A perfect example of this transformation was Volkswagen. After the war, its factory in Wolfsburg had been heavily damaged and production had almost stopped. But with economic recovery, modern investment, and growing demand, the company made the Volkswagen Beetle, which became one of the best-selling cars in history, with more than 21 million units sold worldwide. Another example was Fiat in Italy, which expanded rapidly during the 1950s and helped turn Italy into one of Europe's largest automobile producers. These companies became symbols of Europe's recovery. The Marshall Plan may have provided the initial spark, but it was innovation, skilled workers, and economic reforms that kept the engine running. By the 1960s, Western Europe had become one of the world's strongest economic regions. Yet, as Europe grew wealthier and more independent, another question began to surface. Was the Marshall Plan simply an act of generosity, or was it one of the smartest investments America had ever made?
For decades, the Marshall Plan has been celebrated as one of the greatest humanitarian efforts in modern history, and there is no doubt that it saved millions of lives and helped rebuild devastated nations. But many historians believe it was also one of the smartest geopolitical investments ever made. A prosperous Europe meant stable democracies, stronger trading partners, and fewer opportunities for Soviet influence to spread across the continent. As European industries recovered, they imported more American machinery, technology, and raw materials, creating a cycle that benefited both sides of the Atlantic. It wasn't simply foreign aid, it was the construction of a long-term economic partnership. A great example of this partnership was West Germany. By the early 1950s, it had become one of America's largest trading partners in Europe, importing industrial equipment while exporting high-quality manufactured goods back to global markets. Another example was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, created in 1948 to manage Marshall Plan aid. Instead of each country rebuilding alone, nations like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy coordinated their recovery, encouraged free trade, and reduced economic barriers. This cooperation later evolved into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and eventually inspired deeper European integration, including today's European Union. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild economies, it changed how European countries worked together. But as the decades passed and Europe became wealthier than ever, many Americans began asking a difficult question. Was this partnership still benefiting both sides equally, or had the balance begun to change?
Every successful partnership comes with responsibilities, and the alliance between America and Europe was no different. While Western Europe focused on rebuilding its economy, the United States took on the role of protecting the continent from the growing Soviet threat. Thousands of American troops remained stationed across Europe, military bases were expanded, and billions of dollars were invested in maintaining NATO's defense system. This arrangement allowed many European governments to spend less on their militaries and more on rebuilding their societies. Instead of preparing for another war, they invested in schools, hospitals, modern highways, scientific research, and industries that fueled long-term economic growth. A clear example was West Germany, where the United States maintained tens of thousands of troops throughout the Cold War. American bases in cities like Ramstein and Stuttgart became symbols of Washington's long-term commitment to European security. Because America carried much of the defense burden, countries such as Germany and the Netherlands were able to devote larger portions of their budgets to economic development rather than military expansion. However, this arrangement also sparked debate. Many Americans questioned whether it was fair for U.S. taxpayers to finance Europe's security for decades, while others argued that these military commitments also protected American influence, trade, and global leadership. As Europe grew wealthier and more self-confident, this debate became louder, setting the stage for a new era in transatlantic relations.
So, did Europe become rich because of American money? The answer is both yes and no.
American financial aid gave Europe the chance to recover, but money alone could never rebuild an entire continent. The real transformation came from the determination of millions of Europeans, bold economic reforms, technological innovation, and decades of political cooperation. West Germany is one of the best examples. After the war, much of its industry had been destroyed, yet within just 20 years it became Europe's economic powerhouse, exporting world-famous brands like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, and Siemens. Similarly, France modernized its industries, while Italy became one of the world's leading producers of automobiles and machinery. American investment opened the door, but Europeans walked through it with hard work and innovation. Another powerful example comes from the European Union itself. The cooperation encouraged during the Marshall Plan years gradually evolved into deeper economic integration. Countries that had once fought devastating wars against each other began trading freely, investing together, and building one of the world's largest single markets. Today, the European Union represents one of the strongest economic blocs on Earth, a future that would have been difficult to imagine in the ruins of 1945. This shows that the Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding buildings, it helped create an environment where long-term peace and prosperity could flourish. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson in history. The nation that helps rebuild the world often helps shape the future. The Marshall Plan proved that financial power can sometimes achieve what military power cannot. Instead of conquering territory, America expanded its influence through investment, trade, and strategic partnerships. More than 70 years later, its impact can still be seen in global finance, international trade, and the alliances that continue to shape our world. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to uncover more hidden stories about money, power, and history, make sure you subscribe to Finance History. Don't forget to like this video,